In making these videos, as I make them, I realize there's certain parts of my thought process that it's difficult to share, or I don't necessarily know how to share it immediately. I'm like, these are interesting thoughts, but I don't know how to articulate them yet. They're sort of pre-articulate, but the seeds of them are there. And without further ado, I'm just going to be recording myself listening to Maps of Meaning, because that's what I was doing beforehand. And I may make commentary. I'll probably make commentary afterward, but this is my thought process. Like, if you're interested in understanding my thought process, this is my thought process. So I'll probably call this video something like my thought process listening to Maps of Meaning. If you're interested, it's quite interesting. It's very interesting. It's actually like the most interesting. And I'm really trying to, part of what I'm trying to do on YouTube is I'm trying to take the ideas expressed in Maps of Meaning, Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, the Bible, the Tao Te Ching, and many, many, many others, and I'm trying to condense them down into some form of immediate action encoded in an articulate philosophy that is reflected in what I'm building. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I find it very engaging. So yeah, like that's literally what I'm trying to do. It sounds kind of crazy, but I'm trying to take the collective wisdom of humanity and bring it into myself and make it articulate to myself as I act it out. I didn't even know that's necessarily what I was trying to do until I sat there and articulated it. I didn't know in an articulate manner, because I hadn't made myself articulate it yet. But here we go.
Category out of all uncategorical entities, all that happens is it starts to fragment, because there's actually no unity there. And one of the things you are starting to see is that there's power battles emerging on the part of the excluded, on the left. And it's inevitable, because, and I think that's what this story is trying to represent, is that you can't build the state up beyond a certain size. If you do, it will fragment and fall apart. The people within it will no longer speak the same language, and they'll disperse themselves to different corners of the earth. And so I think we're actually in real danger of forgetting this. And one of the things that I read a couple of ominous things. So if you plot the size of economic catastrophes over the last 30 years, they're getting bigger each time. So that's scary. Now, part of that is because the world economy is getting bigger, and so maybe you have to control for that. But the magnitude of the chaos has been increasing with each collapse. Okay. One of the things that came out of the last collapse, 2008, was the government rescuing collapsed companies like AIG and the Royal Bank of Scotland, which, by the way, was the biggest company in the world. No one knows that, but Royal Bank of Scotland collapsed. It was the biggest company in the world. And AIG was the insurer of insurers. And so it collapsed too. They were rescued by the government, and maybe fair enough. But one of the motifs that came out of that was the idea of too big to fail. Well, this story says, wait a second. It says, too big means definite failure. It means inevitable failure. And that strikes me as highly probable, is that there's a warning in this story, although it's a bare story, right? It's only 4 or 5 lines. It's just the outlines, but it's placed in a very particular place. It's placed right after the flood, right? It's like, well, there's the nihilistic chaos of the flood, and then there's the totalitarian temptation to build hyperstructures that can theoretically replace the transcendent. Well, what happens? You build the hyperstructure and it fragments from within, and then people don't speak the same language, and they distribute themselves sort of chaotically on the surface of the earth. So, therefore, is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. I think the other issue too is that what's the problem with the homogenization of a group? It's like you bring everyone into the group and then they're all the same. Uniformity. Well, the advantage is you can understand everyone. The disadvantage is there's no variability left, right? There's no variability. Everyone is a clone of everyone else. And that's great if you know where you're going and you know how to get there, but it's really, really bad if the underlying structure shifts on you, because the fact that you're adapted to one situation, hyper adapted to one situation, might mean that you're completely not adapted to the next situation. You build groups that are too big and too homogenous. They're effective, but only within the limited range of their map. And if the map no longer functions, then the whole thing sinks. And that's, I think, what happens in this particular story. And then, okay, at the end of that, then what happens is that soon afterwards, and I think perhaps immediately afterwards, the story of Abraham emerges. And that's really, I would say, that's when the prime myths, the primal myths, take on a more historical element, and history, roughly speaking, history as we know it begins something like 6,000 years ago. So, and then the rest of the biblical stories proceed apace from there. What basically happens is that this is something that was well mapped out by Northrop Frye, and you'd think at the University of Toronto that you all would have been encouraged to read Northrop Frye, because he was perhaps the greatest literary scholar that the University of Toronto ever produced. And what he outlined the Old Testament very interestingly. He said that what happens after these initial stories is that the state arises. So it's like the Tower of Babel is continually rebuilt over and over. And it's the state of Israel. The Israelites get their act together, build a state. What happens? They get corrupt. A prophet comes up and says, you better watch out, because what you're doing is not making God happy. And the prophets are very brave, because they come forward. The kings are authoritarian. They can kill them at an instant, but the prophets are moved by walking with God, let's say, for lack of a better argument. They come to the king and say, look, you're not caring for the widows and the children, right? And you think that's okay because they're weak. It's not okay. You're breaking the covenant. You're breaking the rules. And the price for that is, well, we already saw it. The price for that is the flood. It's like, get your act together or you're going to be sorry. Now, sometimes the kings to whom the prophets speak listen, but often they don't. And then the whole bloody state is demolished. And then the Israelites are back, like they're enslaved or they get wiped out by their enemies, or like it's a complete bloody catastrophe and it lasts for centuries. And then they kind of struggle back up and make another state. And then they get arrogant, and then it gets corrupt. And then a prophet comes along and says, you know what happened last time? It's like, well, that was 600 years ago, right? And I know everything now, so I don't have to pay any attention to you. They ignore it. And then, and the prophets say, you are violating a fundamental moral order. You're supposed to, as king, you're supposed to be subject to something higher than yourself, right? And it's like the idea that the Mesopotamians had, that the emperor was supposed to be an emissary of Marduk. That's why he was the emperor, because he was a good Marduk. He could confront chaos and make order. That was what gave him his sovereignty. Or the Egyptian pharaoh was a combination of Osiris and Horus. That's what gave him sovereignty. And so the idea was, you get to be king, but you have to act out the spirit of being king. And if you don't do that, then, well, king or not, all hell's going to break loose. And that's what the prophets continue to say. But the Israelites, they don't pay enough attention, and they continue to get absolutely demolished. And so the Old Testament can be read, at least in part, as the description of a sequence of the rise and fall of states and their descent into corruption and chaos. And so we'll leave it at that, because I want to tell you the next part of the story, the last part of the story, roughly speaking, in our next lecture, which is also the last lecture. So we've got about 12 minutes if we want it. So if anybody has any questions, you can ask them, and if you don't, then we can call it a day. So does well, it's a lot of information, so, and it's a lot of strange information, so I'm curious, what do you make of it?
So two sort of separate and interrelated questions. You were talking about Europe being around 300 million people. So why is a group of similar size, which is America, will it face similar?
Do you think the right and left can talk to each other?
Sure.
Do you think they speak the same language?
Right.
So you see that fragmenting occurring, and they really are. Not only are they speaking different languages, they really are speaking different languages. It's the right way of thinking about it. Yes, it's very, very dangerous. I think the U.S. worked for a long time. First of all, because it didn't always have 300 million people. It's a lot of people to put under one umbrella. Now, the utility of the American system is that it is a hierarchy, right? There's individuals, families, towns, states, underneath a somewhat loose federal structure. And that's sort of, so it's not It's not a monolith where everyone has to speak precisely the same language. It's got some flexibility built into its structure because it's
I bet the
formulated
state
into
governments
components which have a
love
certain amount of
Doge.
autonomy. And so far that's worked sufficiently well. Whether it will, and it'll probably continue to work. I mean, the Americans are a very, very robust people, and they've gone through things that are analogous to what they're going through now many times. God only knows, right? But it's a very dangerous thing to presume that the Americans
Jordan
are down for the
Peterson,
count,
you're an
because
American
they have an uncanny
too.
ability to rise out from the ashes even stronger than they were before. But you can certainly see the danger lurking. In Europe, that's a different thing. Like, I think the European state is doomed, because I think it grew too fast, and it severed the connection between, like, there's not the proper hierarchy of identification. So, and people are saying, wait, Brussels, like, who the hell are you guys? Why are you making decisions for us? And we don't agree with your decisions. And, like, are you sure that Greece and Germany can be in the same place? Because that's by no means self-evident, right? The Germans aren't very happy about it, and the Greeks aren't very happy about it. And one of the rules for making an organization is that it's a lot easier to make a functional organization worse than it is to make a dysfunctional organization better. And so you might say, well, you've got Germany and France and England. Well, let's say Germany and France, powerhouses, especially Germany, they can afford to bring Greece in. Well, maybe, but there's no evidence that they can afford it. So, I mean, Greece is unbelievably corrupt. No one pays their income tax. That's a big problem, right? And bringing them into a union at a high order has no effect whatsoever on the micro behaviors. And the thing is, the micro behaviors have to be rectified. And no one really knows how to do that. How do you stop a country where people don't pay their taxes from, how do you stop people from not paying their taxes? Why do we pay our taxes? Who knows? We could just all of a sudden decide not to. The government wouldn't have the resources to run around gathering them all up. For one reason or another, it's become customary for people in functional Western democracies to pay their taxes. But why? Who knows? It would have been way easier for us just to do what the Greeks did and pretend to pay them. So they're too big, I think. And so the people on the right are saying, back to the nation. Like, I understand why they're doing that, but the danger is the nation will subordinate the individual. And I do see it as another example of safe spaces. It's just scales different. So, and that's why I think that the proper antidote to that, to both the chaos on the left and the order on the right, roughly speaking, is to walk the proper line in the middle. And we better do that, because things are too chaotic right now. So it's not good. Maybe it's really good. That's possible. But we're in a state where, I really believe we're in a state where things could go any number of ways. There's no predicting. So, and I've never felt that, you know. I mean, I lived in the 80s, and, you know, political correctness rose up in the 90s as well. And I can remember a lot of what happened in the early 70s with the oil crisis and all that. So there were times when things were shaky, but they weren't shaky the way they are now. They're an internal shakiness, rather than something that was a threat that was seemed to be imposed from the outside. And that's different. And it is associated with this intellectual war that's going on, postmodernism, and Marxism, and all of that as well. So,
the future authoring program, there's a heavy emphasis on the need to use imagery to conceptualize the ideal and worst future. You mentioned that the program's positive effects are much more pronounced in men, specifically non-Western ethnic men. So I wanted to ask, are imagery, specifically goal-directed imagery and visual spatial ability related? And if so, given that men on average have greater visual spatial ability, could this account for the gender difference in the programs that we see?
that's a lot of questions. They're good questions. Well, I'll tell you a couple of strange things, things that I don't really understand. The first is, when we've done the analysis of the effects of the future authoring program, it has had a differential impact on men. And it's had a particularly differential impact on what I would call excluded men. And so that would be non-Western ethnic minority men, or majority men who aren't doing very well. So, for example, at Mohawk College, the future authoring program had a particularly robust effect on Mohawk College students who were men who hadn't done very well in high school and who hadn't picked a major that had a destination, a career destination at its end. So you can imagine those people they have an ambiguous relationship with the idea of education, and they're not oriented specifically towards a goal. They're not very motivated. Now, why did it have a differential effect on men? That's a good question. Well, first of all, the women are doing better. So it might just be a matter of the fact that it does better for people who aren't doing as well, and at the moment, most of them are men. I think that might be part of it, but I don't believe that's all of it. I think that part of the reason that women are doing better is because they're agreeable. And so if a system sets out a structure and says, here's a pathway to attainment, the women won't rebel against that. They'll go along with it, and that's working very well for them. The men, especially the men on the disagreeable end of the distribution, and there's way more men on the disagreeable end of the distribution than there are women, right? That's what you get from, if you look at overlapping on the distributions. So there's the female distribution for agreeableness, male distribution for agreeableness. Tremendous overlap. Okay, women are higher. All the really agreeable people are women. All the really disagreeable people are men. And maybe the real differences occur at the extremes, right? And it's a very interesting side effect of overlapping distributions. So people can be mostly the same, but that can still produce radical differences. Disagreeable men won't do anything they don't want to do. They just say, up yours. I'll go home and play video games. I'm not listening to your
I'll train
class.
martial arts.
And why should I work for you? I'll just go have fun. I'll do my own thing.
I'll conquer the world.
And so then if you take the men who are like that and you say, okay, what do you want? You can have what you want, but you have to figure out what it is. So then they write down what they want. They think, oh, hey, well, that might be worth having, so maybe I'll put some effort into it. That's what it looks like to me. Now, that's weak evidence. And this is a weak argument. But I'm trying to stretch out my understanding to account for this. But I'll tell you something else that's really weird. I don't understand this either. So, more than 90% of the people who watch my videos on YouTube are men. Now that's weird because about 80% of psychology students are women. So that is not what you would expect, right? You'd expect that the majority of them would be women. And you might say, well, it's because of the political stance I've taken. And I thought, well, that's possible. So I went and looked at the demographic data because I have that. Well, before I did any of the political videos, 85% of my viewers were men. So it's actually increased a bit. It's increased by 6%. And that's not trivial, but it was still overwhelmingly men. So that was interesting. I thought, what the hell? Why is that exactly? And then now I've been watching crowds when I've been talking to them. And the crowds that have come to see me in person. This happened at the University of Toronto free speech debate. And I actually noticed it and commented on it before the debate took place because I was talking about intrinsic differences between men and women. And I looked around the room and I thought, hey, 80% of the people in this room are men. So I had all the women stand up and then all the men stand up and said, look, like, here's a natural experiment. For some reason, 80% of the people who showed up to this are men. Now, everybody thought I was kind of cracked to do that. And it was a risk, but I thought, no, there's something going on here. And then what's interesting now is that every public appearance that I've made that's related to the sort of topics that we're discussing is overwhelmingly men. It's like 85 to 90%. And so I thought, wow, that's weird. Like, what the hell's going on here exactly? And then the other thing I've noticed is that I've been talking a lot to the crowds that I've been talking to, not about rights, but about responsibility, right? Because you can't have the bloody conversation. What are you doing? You can't have the conversation about rights without the conversation about responsibility, because your rights are my responsibility. That's what they are, technically. So you just can't have only half of that discussion. And we're only having half that discussion. The question is, well, what the hell are you leaving out if you only have that half of the discussion? And the answer is, well, you're leaving out responsibility. And then the question is, well, what are you leaving out if you're leaving out responsibility? And the answer might be, well, maybe you're leaving out the meaning of life. That's what it looks like to me. It's like, here you are, suffering away. What makes it worthwhile? Rights? You're completely out. You have no idea what it's almost impossible to describe how bad an idea that is. Responsibility. That's what gives life meaning. It's like lift a load. then you can tolerate yourself, right? Because look at, you're useless, easily hurt, easily killed. Why should you have any self-respect? That's the story of the fall. Pick something up and carry it. Make it heavy enough so that you can think, yeah, well, useless as I am, at least I could move that from there to there. Well, what's really cool about that is that when I talk to these crowds about this, the men's eyes light up. And that's very, like, I've seen that phenomenon because I've been talking about this mythological material for a long time. And I can see when I'm watching crowds, people, you know, their eyebrows lift, their eyes light up because I put something together for them. And that's what mythological stories do. So I'm not taking responsibility for that. That's what the stories do. So I say the story and people go click, 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 you know, and their eyes light up. But this responsibility thing, that's a whole new order of this, is that young men are so hungry for that, it is unbelievable. And one of the things I've been talking to some of the people who've been running for the Conservative leadership in Canada, and I've been talking to them about, well, the difficulties they have communicating with young people, because Conservatives, what the hell are they going to sell to young people, right? Because being Conservative is something that happens when you're older. They can sell responsibility. No one's selling it. And the thing is, for men, there's nothing but responsibility. You know, I was watching The Simpsons the other day. I watched the first Simpsons episode, and I deconstructed it. And so it's really interesting. So what happens in the first Simpson episode is that it's Christmas, and Homer and Marge are going to buy some Christmas presents, but Homer doesn't get his Christmas bonus. And so he's absolutely crushed by that. And that actually is a recurring theme in The Simpsons, where Homer loses his job or something like that, or can't make enough money. He's completely crushed. Even though he's kind of useless, bumbling, laughing fool of a guy, you know, the thing that gives that show its soul is that he's still oriented towards his family. That's what makes him honorable, is that foolish as he is, he's decided to adopt responsibility for his family and to try to bear that. And so he's a holy fool. He's not a complete fool. And it's so interesting watching the story because he suffers dreadfully as a consequence of not being able to fulfill his responsibility. Well, that's for men. Women have their sets of responsibilities. They're not the same, right? Because they're complicated, because women, of course, have to take primary responsibility for having infants at least, but then also for caring for them. They're structured differently than men. For biological necessity, even if it's not a psychological issue, and it's also partly a psychological issue. Women know what they have to do. Men have to figure out what they have to do. And if they have nothing worth living for, then they stay Peter Pan. And why the hell not? Because the alternative to valued responsibility is impulsive, low-class pleasure. And you saw that in the Pinocchio story, right? That's Pleasure Island. It's like, well, why lift a load if there's nothing in it for you? That's another thing that we're doing to men that's a very bad idea. And to boys. It's like, you're pathological and oppressive. It's like, fine then, why the hell am I going to play? If that's the situation, if I get no credit for bearing responsibility, you could bloody well be sure I'm not going to bear any. But then, you know, your life is useless and meaningless, and you're full of self-contempt and nihilism, and that's not good. And so that's why that's what I think's going on at a deeper level with regards to men needing this direction. A man has to decide that he's going to do something. He has to decide that.
And with the imagery, you give a sort of a tactical thing to work towards, or like in the diagram from A to B, to give a sort of image to B so that the man...
Yeah, well, you know, partly what you're trying to do in the future authoring process is say, okay, well, what's your highest value? Right? It's the star. It's like, okay, what are you aiming for? You can decide, man. But, you know, there's some criteria. It should be good for you. It should be good for you in a way that facilitates you moving forward. Maybe it should be good for you in a way that's also good for the family and the community. It should cover the domain of life. I mean, there's constraints on what you should regard as a value. But within those constraints, you have the choice. You have choice. Well, the thing is that people will carry a heavy load if they get to pick the goddamn load. So, and they think, well, I won't carry any load. It's like, okay, fine, but then you're like the sled dog that doesn't have a sled to pull. You're gonna tear pieces out of your own legs because you're bored. You know, people are pack animals. They need to pull against a weight. And that's not true for everyone. It's not true particularly, say, for low conscientious people. I mean, maybe they're open and creative or extroverted and some other things. But for the typical person, they'll eat themselves up unless they have a load. This is why there's such an opiate epidemic among dispossessed white middle-aged guys who are unemployed in the US. It's like they lose their job, they're done, right? They despise themselves. They develop chronic pain syndromes and depression, and the chronic pain is treated with opiates. It's like that's what we're doing. So yeah, that's what it looks like to me. Is you have to, and it's so interesting to watch the young men when you talk to them about responsibility. They're so goddamn thrilled about it. It just blows me away. It's like, really? That's the counterculture. Grow the hell up and do something useful. Really? I could do that? Oh, I'm so excited by that idea. No one ever mentioned that before. It's like rights. Jesus, it's appalling. And I feel that that's deeply felt by the people who are coming out to listen to these sorts of things too. They've had enough of that. So, and they better have, because it's a non-productive mode of being. Responsibility, man. That's where the meaning in life is.
You have the right to eat soybean oil and die.
All right, good. One more class, eh? We'll see you next week.
So right now, I have the option to either meditate, be cutting it close, so I like to meditate for at least 15 minutes, or go inside, maybe get a half second of journaling done before the plumber comes so I can show him the hot water heater and get him to give me a quote on that. I don't even know if he'll be here at exactly 3, but I want to be prepared for him to be here at exactly 3. So I'm going to go do that.